Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and today we're going to be covering how to handle common route issues in the PMDG 737. We'll look at discontinuities, vector legs, flights with no departure procedures, flights with no arrival procedures, and I'll point out a few tips on how to fly all of these along the way. I'm by no means an expert when it comes to the 737, so if there's anything you think I could do differently, feel free to let me know in the comments, but my goal with this video is really just to help beginners get through a lot of the things that I struggle to figure out, and some of these might not be the right way or the wrong way to do it. It's just what works for me. A lot of beginner tutorials, including my own, show you how to fly a best case scenario route where everything sequences properly, but in reality you often need to deal with a bunch of different situations throughout the flight with regards to your route. By far, the most common issue you're going to run into is a discontinuity in your flight plan, which leaves a gap in your route, and if we were to leave this like it is, when the plane gets to that point, it wouldn't know what to do next. When you're just getting started, your first instinct is to remove any discontinuities in your route to make it contiguous again, and oftentimes that is going to be fine. For example, with these two waypoints, we're effectively continuing a straight line, so it's a quick fix to just load the next waypoint into the scratch pad and then plop it on top of the empty boxes and confirm the change to get rid of the discontinuity. Where it gets tricky is that some discontinuities don't flow directly from one point to the next. For example, this one here has a turn coming up, and getting rid of a discontinuity like this one can actually make it near impossible to fly the approach properly. That's the type of problem we're going to focus on today, which sometimes manifests itself as a discontinuity, but there are a few other cases that you need to know how to handle as well. Let's start off easy with a vector leg on a departure procedure, and for this example we're preparing a short flight from Los Angeles down to San Diego. The SimBrief route that I picked has us on the LAX-1 departure, which is a vector departure, meaning that after takeoff, rather than immediately going to a specific waypoint on the procedure, you would be guided to a waypoint by ATC. A vector departure is always easy to spot on the chart because it'll have these little black arrows to signify that from this point on, you're on the vector leg until you're cleared to a given waypoint on the procedure. For this departure, that would likely be the Seal Beach VOR, so if you're flying with ATC, very shortly after takeoff, they would start vectoring you towards that point, which is really just a fancy way of saying that they're directing you there. In the FMC itself, you can see that we've got our initial climb on the runway heading, and then we need to turn to a heading of 221, which matches our chart, and at that point, we fall onto the vector leg. To prepare for all of that before takeoff, I'm going to make sure that my heading indicator is set to match the initial vector leg heading, so it's 221 in this case, and all arm headings select as well so that it's ready to go if I need to enable the autopilot. Once we're on the vector leg, the FMC doesn't automatically sequence itself to the next waypoint like it normally does. In fact, it's actually waiting for us to action it to tell it which waypoint we've been cleared to. It's at this point that ATC would tell you what heading to fly to get you on your way, but AI-based ATCs can be a bit so-so when it comes to vectoring you around, so it's best to be ready to vector yourself to get to the waypoint regardless. For that reason, I tend to give myself about 40 miles of forward visibility on the ND so that I can easily see where that next waypoint is, and I can do it myself if I have to. Sometimes it can also make sense to skip one of the waypoints of the SID if there isn't any other traffic or it's just more convenient. For example, here it might make more sense to go direct to Oceanside instead. If you're flying with AI ATC, they are most likely going to give you a direct to the first waypoint, but you can always request another fix afterwards if you want to skip it. Either way, it's at this point that we can sequence the box to go there, which is very similar to dealing with a discontinuity. So you load your waypoint you want to go direct to by clicking on it, and then you bring it right to the top of the route. That'll ask you to confirm the change, and once that's done, you can activate LNAV, and it'll take over following your route for you, at least until it runs into the next discontinuity. Let's look at another common departure scenario now, which is a route without a SID, and this is something that you're going to see frequently when flying out of smaller airports. It can also happen if you pick a route in SimBrief that simply doesn't use a departure procedure, even though one is available, and that's what we're going to look at here in Rochester. In cases like this, the route in the FMC goes straight from the runway to the first waypoint, and there won't be a vector leg like in the previous scenario. It's really bringing us straight to that first waypoint after takeoff. I'll often fly it like this anyways, but sometimes this can look kind of weird on the ND, especially when you're taking off in one direction, but you're actually departing in the other. What you can do in those cases is create a waypoint manually, just to give yourself a neater looking departure leg. Doing that's really easy, and the waypoint we'll add is going to be relative to the airport. So the first step is to put the airport identifier in, and then we need to figure out what heading our waypoint is going to be relative to the airport. To keep things simple for this example, we'll just put it ahead of us on the runway heading. So that's 040, and then we're going to add a slash, and then we're going to put it 15 miles out. And like that, it gives us a bit of a buffer after takeoff and before we turn towards our first actual waypoint. From there, we can load our waypoint right at the top, and you can see it's going to add it just a bit ahead of us after takeoff. Once we add that new waypoint, it inserts a discontinuity right after it, and it's here that you can decide if you want to add a second waypoint or if you just want to get rid of the discontinuity and go to your original first waypoint. If you wanted, you could build yourself a whole departure procedure this way to have an idea of how you'll vector yourself around, especially if you're flying somewhere that you're not familiar with or maybe there's lots of terrain around. For the most part though, like I said, I tend to fly without adding any extra waypoints. I'm going to remove it for now, but it's always good to have it as an option in your back pocket. Once you're actually flying the route, just like in the previous scenario, ATC will eventually clear you direct to your first waypoint, and at that point we can go back to the FMC to resequence it. This time though, you just have to reload that first waypoint again and put it right at the top of your route, literally overwriting it with the same waypoint. Once you execute that, it'll have the effect of updating the ND from your present location, and then from there we can go to LNAV at that point and activate the autopilot if you haven't yet either. Alright, let's switch over to looking at approaches now, which is similar in a lot of ways, but there are a few extra things that I want to point out. Our flight from Rochester that we were just looking at was taking us out to Montreal, and we're flying on the HAB 7 arrival, which if you look right at the end of it, has those same black arrows that we saw on our vector departure. This is actually just the opposite of what we looked at earlier, and once we reach the last waypoint at Ovuvi, we fall onto a vector leg, so we have to be ready to deal with that. The leg past that last waypoint extends out to infinity, and the FMC won't sequence to the next waypoint automatically for you like it normally does. It's waiting for you to do it. One of the reasons it's done this way is for spacing with other traffic so that they can turn them towards final when it makes sense, but it actually works in your favor too, especially if you're coming in too fast or too high, because it gives you more time. You can continue past that last waypoint as long as you need. The only thing you would want to do before going past it is to put yourself in heading select, since LNAV won't know what to do. When you're configured and ready to turn final, all we've got to do again is go back to the FMC, and we'll bring the next leg after the vector leg right at the top of our route. Once you execute that, the route again updates itself on the ND, and ideally you should turn yourself in that direction with heading select. I activated LNAV here, but I've actually had issues with that sometimes where it falls into another mode on the approach, so I think you're best to stick with heading select. Then once you're about 20 to 30 degrees offset from the final approach course, we can arm approach mode, and then from there it's just like a normal landing. The last scenario that I want to look at is a flight without an arrival procedure, which has a discontinuity leading into the approach. That's what we're looking at here. We're actually just continuing the flight we took off from earlier at LAX, and we're coming in to land in San Diego on the RNAV to runway 27. The route that I picked is a real-world route, and it goes from the LAX-1 departure we were looking at earlier to the Mission Bay VOR, and then from there we run into a discontinuity before flying the RNAV approach. If we try to remove the discontinuity by going straight to the initial approach fix from Mission Bay, it would cause us problems, which you can just sort of see at the top of the ND. Mission Bay takes us way too close to the airport, and it makes getting turned around 180 degrees to fly the approach really difficult in that tight of a space. The FMC is even hinting at it with the bypass that it's put between Lindy and Vida. Basically what that's saying is that the turn radius is too tight to fly over the waypoint, and it's going to skip it. For something like this, you need to start planning what you're going to do well ahead of time, especially because there is a fair bit of terrain around San Diego as well. The neat thing though is that since this is a real world route, I just looked up on Flight Radar 24 to see how they actually fly it, but I think if you've been watching this whole video, you've already got an idea of what we're gonna do. Since Mission Bay brings us in too tight, I'm actually going to start vectoring myself well before I get to that point, usually around 15 miles out, and I'm basically looking to put myself on a very wide downwind lake. That's basically what the real world flights do as well. They get vectored around well before they get to Mission Bay just to try and square out the approach intercept angle. Like I mentioned earlier though, approach vectors can get pretty iffy with tools like Beyond ATC, and I would say I end up ignoring it about 80% of the time still, unfortunately. Hopefully this gets better in the future, but as of right now I find it much easier to ignore them and do it myself. But again, in a place like San Diego, you need to be aware of your surroundings as well. That's why I've got terrain enabled on the ND. It at least gives me just that little bit more situational awareness, and I try to configure the plane for the approach earlier than normal in these scenarios just to let me focus on the vectoring. Again, I'm doing all of this with heading select, and once we're close to being parallel with the first waypoint of the approach, we can go back in the FMC to sequence it. And as you can see, now that I'm doing that, it's not showing the bypass waypoint anymore between Lindy and Vida, so we should be good to go. Since we're flying an RNAV approach here, at this point I've rearmed LNAV to fly it, and then I just refocused on preparing everything for the approach and landing. I hope all of the route scenarios that we just looked at help you out for your next 737 flight, and if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like it and subscribe to get more similar content to this one.